3. Objectives by key stakeholder. The first point of departure from the conventional approach to objective setting is that we set objectives by key stakeholders. What this means is that objectives are developed not as a single group for an organization or business unit, something that most directors and managers get wrong, but by key stakeholders. Objectives for customers, for employees, for suppliers, for owners, and objectives for any other relevant key stakeholder. Maybe objectives for competitor. This point of departure also establishes a position of clarity. Clarity is one of the most important concepts in communication and in management. The process is much clearer than when objectives are established as a non-differentiated set. If key stakeholders are implicit in objective setting, then by making them explicit, objective setting should become easier. In fact, it does. Figure 5.4 has been encountered earlier in this course as figure 4.1. The difference between this version and the previous one is that the word objectives has been introduced. In the previous version, funds was present, where the word objectives now is. The same goes for owners. In the case of employees, the word effort has been replaced by objectives, while for suppliers, objectives have replaced the words good or services. In this section, we explain what this substitution means. Strategic factors for each of the key stakeholders are shown as outward flows from the organization. These are the things that an organization needs to get right, as far as the key stakeholders are concerned. In the case of customers, as we know, strategic factors might be product quality, customer service, delivery, and price. But while an organization needs to build strategy around these factors, it also needs to identify what it wants from its key stakeholders. Otherwise, strategic planning could become a one-way street, with an organization giving all and getting a little back. Figure 5.4 shows that when an organization gets back its results on its objectives. In the case of customers, it wants funds, so objectives are based on this requirement. While organizations preach customer service and satisfaction, at the end of the day, they want their customers' money. If, as in the case of a public library, the service is free, the library still wants something from its customers, goodwill, because this goodwill may lead to an increase in funds from the library's owner, the government. In the case of suppliers, an organization or business unit wants the supply of goods or services in full and on time. Objectives are set around this requirement. In the case of employees, an organization or business unit wants effort. And again, objectives are based on this requirement. So, The organization or business unit will do its darndest on the strategic factors for employees, expecting the latter in turn to meet its objectives. Finally, an organization will apply itself to the strategic factors for owners to ensure that the owners continue to provide funds. Four, setting objectives via behavioral outcomes. There's a step between identifying key stakeholders and developing objectives. This is the establishment of behavioral outcomes. Behavioral outcomes are what we want our key stakeholders to do. Just ask a planning team what are its organization's objectives, and you'll get a blank look. Ask the planning team what it wants its key stakeholders to do, and you'll get a lively discussion. Figure 5.5 Behavioral Outcomes and Objectives presents some typical behavioral outcomes. This is by no means a complete picture, nor can you transpose behavioral outcomes from one organization to another. They vary according to organization and industry. What you can see in Figure 5.5 is a common sense way in which we write down these behavioral outcomes. You can also see how they are translated into objectives. For example, the behavioral outcomes for customers, they buy more, is translated into to increase sales. They buy our high margin products is translated into to increase sales of high margin products. Remember, of course, that this figure shows only typical behavioral outcomes and objectives. The appropriate ones for your organization or business unit may be quite different. 5. Performance indicators on objectives. And this is a very important point. If we're going to establish a strategy that is framed by objectives, the objectives need to be quantified. Many organizations develop vague statements of objectives that are often described as motherhood statements or platitudes. We develop measures based on objectives, and from this working list of measures, there's still a short list called KPIs, Key Performance Indicators. So, how to translate objectives into key performance indicators is illustrated by the example of Suncoast Cancer Council. We work with this organization, not its real name, assisting it to identify its key stakeholders, set objectives, and develop KPIs on these objectives. The key stakeholders, including government as client, supporters, volunteers. For each of these key stakeholders, the Council established behavioral outcomes, a sample of which is shown in Figure 5.6, measuring objectives for the organization Suncoast Cancer. One of the outcomes was for the government to provide grants and contracts. In the case of supporters, one of the behavioral outcomes was to provide funds. With volunteers, one of the outcomes was to provide their time. Figure 5.6 shows how each behavioral outcome has been converted into an objective. For example, the behavioral outcome for government as client, provide grants and contracts has been converted into the objective to increase funds from government via grants and contracts. It is important to realize that objectives don't have to be in dollar terms, as we see in the case of volunteers, which objective is to increase volunteer time. The behavioral outcome, provided their time has been converted into the objective to increase volunteer time. Once you approach developing objectives in this way, measures emerge almost automatically. Figure 5.6, you can see the short list of measures for objectives. We call these KPIs. This example illustrates how we develop quantified objectives via this system. So, recapitulating, the first step is to identify key stakeholders. The second is to write down the behavioral outcome required from them. The third step is to convert these behavioral outcomes into objectives. And the last step is to develop measures, the short list of which constitutes the KPIs for those objectives. Of course, in understanding and undertaking these steps, you must be selective about whom you nominate as the key stakeholder. Remember, not everybody is a key stakeholder. And about the behavioral outcome you list. Please select only the important ones. Make this a little exercise, like the figure 5.6. If you are selective, at this point you will end up with a short list of objectives and key performance indicators. These will help to achieve focusing strategy, development, and implementation effort. Establishing targets and objectives. The extent to which objectives influence strategy depends on the specific targets established for those objectives. Through not shown, you can imagine an additional column in figure 5.6. It would be to the right of the KPIs for objectives, and its heading would be targets. These would be targets on the KPIs for objectives, which in turn are targets on the objectives themselves. For example, a target on number hours provided by volunteers could be 5,000 hours. Much target setting is a complicated affair. They are set, for example, on customer satisfaction, without reference to their effect on revenue and vice versa. So, an organization may set the targets to raise revenue, let's say 10%, and customer satisfaction maybe by 5%, but not establish a cause and effect relationship between them. Of course, this should and must be done. That is why in my practice the KPIs are mapped for the different stakeholders. So there is a cause and effect relation. Key stakeholders have an impact on each other. Your employees, for example, are the drivers of the whole system, and their efforts influence results on objectives for all other key stakeholders. In setting targets for owners, then you are able to identify the targets necessary for suppliers, customers, and employees. 7. Streamlining objective setting. Planning teams have the potential to produce a vast array of statements that lead an organization or business unit nowhere, and I said nowhere, often being nothing more than platitudes or statements of the obvious, just for filling the gap of the strategic plan. While no one may disagree with them, they usually do not advance an organization or business unit very far, and business units or organization fail to reach their objectives. This chapter has provided a significant advancement, the first of its kind. The first of its components is that objectives are established by key stakeholders. That is a real breakthrough in objective setting. The second component is that for each key stakeholder, we write behavioral outcomes. An example, what an organization or business unit wants from them. The third element is converting these behavioral outcomes into objectives. And the fourth is converting each objective into one or more KPIs via a set of measures. Establishing targets on these KPIs, which in turn are targets on the objectives themselves, is the final ingredient. We believe that this is far a better way to set objectives, and we feel confident about this affirmation because we have used this method with some clients and seen their obvious delight at being able to undertake objectives and their KPI settings with more clarity. So, what do you think about this formula for objective setting and KPI setting? In the subsequent units, we are going to see how to map KPIs to stakeholders to objectives for a cause and effect relationship. So, to achieve results on objectives, you need competitive advantage. Competitive advantage will be the topic for our next unit. You can have all these formulas and figures in your organization or business unit intranet. Let's say a SharePoint. Your objectives, your KPIs, and if you want to go further, you can put them in the Power Apps. So can every employee which is part of getting or achieving this objective can have visualization of them. So this is all for today. Please write your questions. Develop a figure 5.6 measuring objectives for your organization, where you write key stakeholder, behavioral outcome, objectives, and key KPIs for objectives. This is Victor Marromo speaking. I'm a consultant and a strategic planning and performance management coach. Thank you for listening. Sorry for my little broken English. I need to practice it a little bit more. You have to practice it too. Thank you. Goodbye.